So these are all the products we're going to use to make our quick and simple ball caps. Predominantly it's latex, talcum powder, some release agent, a redhead former, and some polyurethane foam. So the first step is we're going to use the release agent on the redhead. Redhead is just a plastic form that Krylon sell, which you can see it's got the shape of the back of the skull, the occipital bone, and flatter on the face, so that you can tell which is the front and which is the back of these. And it's very lightweight, very simple little plastic form. They cost around £25, I think. So you could use anything. You could find a mannequin head or something like that. But the redheads are a particularly good shape and very, very lightweight and easy to acquire and use. So I've sprayed it with release agent. It could be any number of release agents. I've used epoxy Ultra 4 epoxy par film. There's a wax release, there's silicone sprays, all will do the job. So I've sprayed down the redhead, and then I've let the release dry, let it flash off the solvents, and then I've powdered. Now the reason for powdering is when we put our latex on the surface, if you don't have the powder there, the latex will bead up on the surface and you'll get holes in your latex casting. So it's important to use the powder so that when you stipple on your latex, your first layer, you won't get it beading and you'll get a nice thin even layer. Now I'm just using cheap polyurethane sponges, mattress foam, basically cushion foam that's been chopped up into quick little squares that we can stipple away with. Now this first layer, I'm trying to just stipple a fine, even layer. As you can see, I've just got an even texture over the whole thing. If it starts to bead up anywhere, I just go in and stipple a bit more until it stops beading. And you have to be careful to know when to stop, because if you spend too long stippling, you can start building up. The latex starts to dry just a fraction, and it'll start to stick to the sponge, and you'll start getting lots of bits of latex in there, and in fact pull away some of the latex. So you have to be careful. You just get to the point where the latex is sitting nicely on the surface, and then stop stippling, and you can dry. You can use a hairdryer. Try and use just a medium heat. Don't use the hottest heat, because it could soften the plastic and really heat up the plastic of the redhead, making it hard to do subsequent layers. Now for the next layer, rather than stipple again, I could continue stippling, but it probably would take about 7-8 layers to get anything near thick enough. So instead I'm going to do this method, which is just to pour latex over the cap, and this builds up one nice even layer. And it's great because you do get a very even layer, which is a difficult thing to do even when you're stippling by hand. There can be a lot of irregularity, but if you pour over and allow it to drain and keep moving it around, you should end up with one very nice even coat. Now the reason for that first stippled layer is that it still has a tendency to bead if you're not careful. And if you don't do the stippled layer acts as a kind of primer for the surface, so that the subsequent poured layer will sit evenly. But if you go straight on top of the release agent, even with the talcum layer, I almost guarantee it will bead. You can see around the bottom edge where the stippled layer didn't extend to. You can see as those holes open up in the latex as it runs off. So this is why we did that first stippled layer, so that when we poured over this one layer, we get a really nice even layer. Now you can force dry that, but you have to be a little careful because it's a thicker layer. There's a danger you might kind of create ripples in the surface. So I prefer to just let it dry off on its own. Now what I'm going to do here is add a second layer, but just on the crown. I'm just thickening up the top of the head. Very often, if you're doing something with wigs, saying you need to pin through, or you're applying prosthetics, something with a bit of weight on the top, you want a bit more strength. So the one layer with the stipple will give us a nice, really thin cap. and that will leave it thin enough so that when you cut and blend off around the hairline, you should be able to get a reasonably good blend. But that's not a very strong layer, so I'm going to put this second layer on the crown, which will just give me a bit more thickness. It will double up the thickness on the top, and so it won't stretch as much on the top, leaving it thinner at the sides. So that's just going to add that bit more strength. Now the latex I'm using is just what we call a dipping latex. The main thing about it is just straight, very fluid latex. There's no fillers in it, so it's really stretchy, real snapback on it. So to take the cap off now, we've let it dry. Again, but just make sure it's thoroughly dry. And you know it's dry when it's all the whiteness have gone and it's completely transparent. And I'm just going to powder the cap all over. If you don't powder, what happens is the latex has a tendency to stick to itself if you touch two surfaces together. Now, here I'm just working underneath with a brush and a little bit of powder. Now, you've got to be careful not to overstretch the cap. I mean, latex is very stretchy, but if you overstretch it, it'll go kind of baggy, it'll lose its memory. So you have to be very careful not to overstretch it. And that's why I've used the release agent. You can see there, just moving that brush around, the cap's just falling away from the surface, which is exactly what we want. We don't want to be really having to really pull it away and tear it away from the surface. You can see just rubbing that brush around inside with a bit of talcum, and it very easily pops off. So the cap's I'm going to be able to take this ball cap off without too much struggle. So gently take it off, and I'm just going to drop it straight into some powder to just get that last little area powdered so it's not going to stick together, and slip it back onto the redhead. And you can see how nice and even this cap is. Now, to buy a cap like this, as I say, it's probably cost you about £15. So, you know, when you work out the cost of the latex and the time, this is actually a very cost-effective way to make ball caps. And, you know, a cap like this, if you're using it for life casting, or, you know, put it on underneath a prosthetic where you're not going to see the edges, and or as I say, and even in theatre, this will work extremely well on stage. The edges will be thin enough when trimmed and glued to really not be visible. So it's a great way to make your own caps, save a bit of money, and get a very good result.